podcast. My name is Brother Eric, and I'll be sharing about financial support as written by Paul in his epistles. Now, Paul's letters have more to say about the financial support of ministers and fundraising in the church than any other part of the New Testament. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 2 Corinthians 11 to 12, Paul explains why he refuses the financial support that is due to him as an apostle. And in his letters to the Philippians, he thanks the church for their generous contribution and financial support of his ministry. One of the major projects of Paul's ministry was actually to raise money for collections that would go to the poor in Jerusalem. He writes extensively about this collection in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 8 and verse chapter 9, and mention it in Romans chapter 15 at 25 to 32. He also mentioned it in 1 Corinthians 16 1 and 4, and finally he speaks about it in Galatians chapter 2 verse 9 to 10. Now both texts show that for Paul, financial issue always had important theological implication, and that requests for money were to be related to the message of the gospel. Now I'll be looking at 3 reasons to why Paul sought financial support. The first one is financial support of the apostles. The second one will be the collection, and the third will be mission and money. Now, financial support of apostles. The issue of financial support is raised in Paul's defense of his apostleship. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and 2 Corinthians chapter 11 to 12, the most striking aspect of Paul's comment is his refusal to accept the support from the Corinthian congregation, a refusal which evidently gave rise to considerable misunderstanding at Corinth. Now here, the connection between money and authority is at issue. Paul was accused of not having true apostolic authority because he did not receive the usual apostolic support. Now, it is important when you hear me talk about apostolic support or why it became an issue that the church in Corinth were conflicted with Paul's refusal. It is good for us to go into the historical background to the issue of the support. Now, the Corinthians probably questioned Paul's authority because they understood Paul's action in terms of the issue of how teachers and philosophers of their day ought to be supported. In the contemporary Greek society, there was much debate about how philosophers and teachers should support themselves. Most philosophers either charged fee or accepted a patronage of wealthy individuals who gave to their cause. The major criticism of this method of support was that it placed a philosopher under obligation to a patron and therefore jeopardized the philosopher's freedom to teach the truth. Now, in the Hellenistic society, the giving and receiving of benefaction was an extremely important component of the society structure. The wealth expressed their power by becoming patrons, and since benefaction was the basis of friendship, refusing a gift was an act of enmity. Now, philosophers who wished to avoid this network of obligation could either beg, as the cynic chose to do, or work. However, since most of the Greek society looked down on those who worked or to trade or begged, not many philosophers chose those methods of support. Now, looking back into that background in our mind, then we are able to understand why Paul refuses the money in Corinth, in Corinth, and why the Corinth church thinks that Paul has no authority as an apostle. Now, those who did gain freedom at the expense of social status, they had to go by patronage and receive the funds. Now, seeing against this background, the Corinthian misunderstood of Paul's refusal to accept support makes sense. In refusing support from the Corinthian, Paul could be understood as refusing their friendship, one, or refusing to offer them a chance to share in the ministry of the gospel. Now, Paul could also be seen as demeaning the Corinthians as well as himself by working at a trade rather than accepting their patronage. Now, we have already spoken about it, that the Hellenistic philosopher of that time, they either received money from the patronage or they worked out for themselves. Now, if you received the money from the wealthy society, then you had to share part in whatever you taught. And most of the time, they compromised the truth because they were afraid of misappropriating or going against the patronage into whom is giving them support. Now, Paul is not just as an apostle to the church in Corinth, as the congregation at this time have this problem. So the Corinthians want their apostle to have honor in society, and they wanted to share in that honor by supporting him. So they asked whether or not Paul deserved to be honored as a true apostle if he refuses to accept true apostolic support. So the question here arises when Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9 and 2 Corinthians 11 to 12, when he says, I will not take part in the money. Now, does Paul continue to refuse support from this church? Now, that one is something I'll come back to later, but right now, that is one of the reasons when you look back into the historical background to the issue of support, we see why Paul at this time refused to receive support from the church in Corinth. Reason number 2, reason for financial support of the apostle. In 1 Corinthians 9, Paul begins his defense to his apostleship and his right to refuse support by vigorously defend himself as the apostle right to earn a living by preaching the gospel. He says, I as an apostle, I have a right to receive support for preaching the gospel. Paul's authority as an apostle has been challenged, so he starts his defense in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, 1 and 2 by establishing himself as an apostle and reminding the Corinthians that their congregation is the result of his apostolic labor. Now, Paul establishes the fact that he and Barnabas have the same right to material support as other apostles in 1 Corinthians 9, 4 and 14. Now, the apostles had the right to receive food, drink, and to be accompanied by wives who would presumably also be supported. Like other apostles, Paul had the right not to have to work in order to support himself, but he gave his living by the gospel because Paul remembered that the difference it makes. Paul offers several arguments to prove his point about an apostle's right to support. He first uses several analogies that shows that in everyday's life, people expect to be supported by their labor. Now remember, Paul is laboring as a minister to the church in Corinth. Paul then uses the scriptural example to show that the law also speaks on this issue and insists that even animals are to be fed from their labor. Even more to the point, he reminds the Corinthians that those who minister in both Jewish and pagan temples get their food from the sacrifices, and support from those who serve at the altar is part of both the Jewish and the Hellenistic piety. Now, Christian ministers had no difference. So he says, which is why the Lord commands that those who preach the gospel are to live by the gospel. Now, in the argument about apostolic right to support Paul, Paul is defending his apostolic authority. The Greek word here that is used in this chapter is exousia, which is translated right, can also mean authority. Now, understanding that the apostolic authority rather than apostolic right is the major focus on Paul's defense will help us to explain why Paul also argues that he has the authority to give up his apostolic right to material support. In Paul's discussion about apostolic right, he has not only established his rights to be supported, but also he affirmed his authority by his refusal of the same. Now, this authority is based on the preaching of the gospel, not on taking financial support. And this is one thing that I've come to learn, that Paul had the right to support. As an apostle, he has the right to support by preaching the gospel. He should have lived by the gospel. But then he chooses not to because of what is at stake. They were questioning his authority as an apostle because he's refusing the money. But now Paul is coming back to explain to them that this authority is based on the preaching of the gospel and not taking financial support. Now, because he preaches the gospel, he had shown spiritual seed among the Corinthians, seed which had clearly resulted in the congregation, which now questions his authority. He had the right to their material benefit, but he is not under any obligation to receive their support, Paul says, because his primary obligation is to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, and it's from the gospel he receives his apostolic authority. Now, it is good to understand that Paul is simply saying that it is my right, but I will give up my right so that I can preach the gospel of Jesus Christ without having to hedge myself on these people, without these people having to say that we support you, and so you have to speak and you have to say what we need you to say. Now, I gave an example of the Hellenistic philosopher who preached or who taught about their philosophy, and when they got supported by the patronage, then they had to adhere to the rules and the regulation of the same people that is supporting them to preach. Now, Paul says, I do not want to put the question unto the gospel of Jesus, because the authority as an apostle does not come to me because I'm receiving a benefit from you. It's come to me because I'm preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, which actually has given me the authority as an apostle. Now, Paul refuses financial support. Why is Paul refusing the support? He clearly says that he who preaches the gospel should live by the gospel. As an apostle, Paul's primary obligation was to preach the gospel itself. One of the signs of the pastor's authority was that the sake of the gospel, he renounced his right to financial support. One of the signs of his true apostolic authority was that of forsaking of payment, that forsaking of the help, the contribution, so that he can preach the gospel without a heart that is heavy, without a heart that is hedged to somebody, without being boxed. Let me use the word being boxed. So the first reason Paul gives for not accepting financial support is that he does not want to put a stumbling block in the way of the gospel. Exactly. This is the stumbling block, because if he receives the money and he is looking up unto these people, then he might not preach the gospel the way he ought to preach the gospel. So Paul in 1 Corinthians 9 and in 2 Corinthians 11 and 9 and 2 Corinthians 12, 14 and 18, Paul says that he does not want to burden the Corinthians or take advantage of them in any way. As their parent in Christ, he is the one who has brought this church to life. As their parent in Christ, he wants to give them rather than to receive from them. Paul's freedom in preaching the gospel also seemed to be an issue in this church. An appearance of greed or obligation to the Corinth congregation might hurt the cause of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so Paul was wise in this way. He refuses because he did not want to cause a stumbling block. Now, remember, and get me right, I said it was the right of the apostle to feed by the gospel. They lived by the gospel. It is Jesus who commanded, he who works should work and should be paid from whatever he works. But Paul refuses to pay. Paul refuses the support for one reason, that he did not want to put a stumbling block to the gospel of Jesus Christ. The second thing why Paul refuses the financial support is found in 1 Corinthians 9, 15 and 18. Refusing financial support gives Paul a ground for boasting. The second reason why Paul refused the financial support, it was giving him the ground to boast about the gospel. Since his primary obligation as an apostle was to preach the true gospel, he could not boast about his preaching or apostolic authority if the coffers were upon him. But he is under no obligation to receive financial support for his preaching. In fact, the refusal to financial support is what gives him the ground to stand and preach the gospel more effectively. This is the reward that he seeks. When he preaches the gospel free of charge, he is living example of the message that the Lord will supply all his need according to his glorious grace in heaven. Now we see Paul later on telling the church in the Philippi that the Lord will supply their need according to his riches in glory. Now he preaches the gospel with all authority. When he preached this gospel, he preached it free of charge by saying he had received God's grace freely, and he was to preach the gospel freely. That is why Paul can use his boast of not accepting support to expose the false apostles that had entered and infiltrated the church at Corinth. Now, if you look at the book of 2 Corinthians 11, 10 and 18, Paul was refusing so that he can expose the false apostles that had shown at the shores of Corinthian. They were not there for the true gospel, but they were there to receive money. Now we can see that today, that there are so many of us who are preaching the gospel not because we are obligated to preach the gospel and the gospel alone, but we are in this gospel for money. Everything we got, we preach this gospel for money. And we have neglected the true mark of an apostleship, where we refuse of the support so that we can sincerely stand on the ground that the true gospel of Jesus Christ must be preached. The Corinthians think that accepting financial support shows that one is surely a true apostle. But Paul turns this type of thinking around and tells him that the authority that they have is based on the gospel of Jesus Christ and not because of the support that he receives with financial support. The fact that he offers the gospel free of charge and refuse financial support rather than put a stumbling block in the gospel proves that Paul is a true apostle according to the gospel. The single possessions of Paul's life, all things working together for good for the sake of the gospel. So, the other reason why Paul refuses the support is he did not just refuse the support always. And I'll come to that. Paul did not just always refuse the support. Paul's correspondence with the Corinthians church make it clear that he did not accept their financial support at that time. He also appeared to have followed his policy during his time in Thessalonica. 1 Thessalonians 2 and 9, but in 2 Corinthians 11 and 9, Paul mentioned that he has received a gift or he has received support from the Macedonian church during his time in Corinth. Now in Philippians 4:10 and 20, Paul makes a point of thanking the church for their generous gift to him. Now, but remember, this gift to him was not given to Paul when he was still at Macedonia, but he's receiving the gift when he's away from that church. And he says the Philippian church had become partners of Paul in the gospel from the beginning of his ministry, especially during the time that he was in Thessalonica and the time that he went down to Corinth. Their financial partnership reflects the close bond between Paul and the Philippian congregation. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 15, it suggests that Paul and the Philippians had been many occasions received the support to his ministry, and it implies that he actually never received any form of financial support while he was still at Philippi. So for him to accept the financial support from the Philippians and refuse support when he was at Corinth and Thessalonica, it may put as a question, but there is no evidence that Paul ever received money or ever received support when he was in Philippi. He received money from Philippians, but it was while he was in Thessalonica and at the same time he was in Corinthians. That is why Paul is confidently saying, there is not a time that I'll put the gospel of Jesus Christ in jeopardy. This is not inconsistent in Paul's behavior, but it is an example of what he is trying to live. Even though Paul did not accept financial support from the Corinthian church for his ministry at Corinth, he did accept them to support his work later. The Bible says he actually asked for a collection for them to send their money to the saint in Jerusalem. Now when you join me next time, we'll be talking about the collection and why Paul think that the collection he was speaking from the church in Corinth and what it was to be used in Jerusalem. God bless you.
Thank you.